The moment a billionaire says she's mine in front of another man, he's already lost the battle with his own heart. The private poker lounge sat 40 floors above Manhattan, wrapped in gold light and floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked the glittering city below. Low jazz drifted through the room while million-dollar watches flashed beneath crystal chandeliers. Men in tailored tuxedos leaned back in leather chairs, pretending their smiles were friendly while quietly measuring each other like rivals circling a battlefield. Clara Bennett tightened her grip around the silver tray in her hands and reminded herself not to stare. She wasn't supposed to be here tonight. She was only covering someone else's shift at the Blackwood Club after the regular bartender called in sick. One night. 8 hours. $800 in emergency pay. That money meant another week of medication for her mother. Another week before the overdue notices became impossible to ignore. Table 3 needs another Macallan, the floor manager whispered sharply as he rushed past her. Clara nodded quickly and moved toward the private poker table near the windows. The men there barely looked human to her. Too polished. Too expensive. Their cufflinks alone probably cost more than her car. And sitting at the center of them was Damien Cross. Even Clara knew that name. CEO of Cross Meridian. 34 years old. Billionaire. Ruthless in business. Impossible to read. He sat silently in a charcoal suit with one hand resting against a stack of poker chips, dark eyes fixed on the cards in front of him. Unlike the others, he didn't laugh loudly or brag. He barely moved at all. Somehow, that made him even more intimidating. Clara stepped carefully beside the table and poured another drink into a crystal glass. "You're new," one of the men suddenly said. Adrian Vale leaned back in his chair, his expensive smile lazy and dangerous. Clara forced a polite smile. "Just filling in tonight, sir." Adrian's gaze lingered too long. "That's a shame," he murmured. "Someone that pretty shouldn't be hiding behind a bar." Clara felt heat crawl up her neck. She gave the practiced smile women learned to wear when they wanted a conversation to end without creating a scene. "Can I get anyone anything else?" Adrian ignored the question completely. He glanced toward Damien with a smirk. "You seeing this, Cross?" Damien finally looked up. His expression didn't change. Adrian chuckled and swirled the whiskey in his glass. "She's hot." The room went quiet. Clara froze beside the table. Damien's eyes lifted toward her for the first time that night. Calm. Sharp. Impossible to escape. Then, without even blinking, he said, "Careful." Adrian raised an eyebrow. Damien leaned back slowly in his chair. "She's mine." Silence crashed across the poker table. Even the jazz music suddenly felt distant. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Adrian blinked once, genuinely surprised. "Since when?" he asked carefully. Damien didn't answer immediately. And for the first time all evening, something shifted in his expression. Almost like he was hearing his own words for the first time. Clara stared at him, completely stunned. Because whatever game these billionaires were playing, Damien Cross suddenly looked like a man who had accidentally told the truth before realizing it himself. Clara barely remembered leaving the poker lounge. The elevator ride down from the 40th floor felt unreal, her pulse still echoing louder than the soft instrumental music playing through the speakers. "She is mine!" The words repeated in her head again and again like a song she could not turn off. By the time she stepped out onto the Manhattan sidewalk, cold November wind rushed against her face, finally snapping her back to reality. Yellow taxis blurred through the rain-slick streets, while giant digital billboards painted the city in shifting colors. Clara pulled her thin coat tighter and checked her phone. 2 missed calls from the pharmacy. 1 voicemail from the landlord. Her chest tightened instantly. Reality always returned fast. She exhaled slowly and started walking toward the subway station, heels clicking against wet pavement. $800. That was what tonight was supposed to be about. Not billionaires. Not dangerous eye contact. Not Damien Cross looking at her like she belonged beside him instead of carrying drinks around his table. Behind her, black SUVs rolled away from the club entrance one after another. Somewhere up there in those tinted windows sat men who probably spent more money on one poker hand than her mother's treatment cost for an entire year. Clara shoved her hands into her coat pockets and kept moving. 20 minutes later she unlocked the door to her apartment in Queens. The heat barely worked. The kitchen light flickered every few seconds. A stack of unpaid bills sat beside the sink exactly where she had left them that morning. Her mother was asleep on the old couch near the window, wrapped in blankets with a paperback novel resting against her chest. Clara softened immediately at the sight of her. "Mom?" she whispered gently. Her mother stirred awake and smiled weakly. "You are home late." Clara crouched beside her and brushed loose strands of gray blonde hair away from her face. "Big event tonight. Rich people?" her mother asked with a tired smile. Clara laughed quietly. "You have no idea." Her mother studied her for a second. "Something happened." Clara opened her mouth, then stopped. How exactly was she supposed to explain any of this? A billionaire had publicly claimed her like it was instinct. Worse, part of her still remembered the way his voice sounded when he said it. Calm. Certain. Possessive without even trying. "Nothing important," Clara finally lied. Her mother squeezed her hand gently. "Clara Bennett, you have never been good at lying." Clara smiled faintly but looked away before her mother could read too much on her face. Across Manhattan, Damien Cross stood alone inside his penthouse office, staring at the skyline through rain-covered glass. The city lights reflected against the untouched whiskey sitting beside him. His phone buzzed nonstop across the marble desk. Messages. News alerts. Public relations executives already panicking. He ignored all of them. Adrian's voice echoed in his memory. "She is hot." Then his own response immediately after. "She is mine." Damien closed his eyes briefly, jaw tightening. He did not even know why he had said it. That was the problem. Men like Damien Cross calculated everything. Every sentence. Every business move. Every public interaction. Nothing slipped accidentally. Except tonight something had. His assistant finally stepped carefully into the office. "Sir?" Damien did not turn around. "What?" "There is already footage online from the club." Damien slowly looked back over his shoulder. "How bad?" His assistant hesitated. 5 million views in under 2 hours. Silence filled the office again. Then the assistant swallowed carefully before adding, "The internet thinks you have a secret girlfriend." Damien stared at the glowing city below him, while somewhere deep inside his chest, something unfamiliar and dangerous quietly began to unfold. By sunrise, Clara Bennett had become internet famous without understanding how her life had changed overnight. Her phone vibrated nonstop across the tiny kitchen counter while coffee brewed weakly in the background. At first she ignored it, assuming it was another debt collector or spam call, but after the 20th notification, even she could not pretend anymore. Slowly, she picked up the phone and opened social media. Her stomach dropped instantly. Every major entertainment account had reposted the clip from the poker lounge. Damien Cross sitting beneath golden light. Adrian smirking across the table. Then Damien's calm voice cutting through the room like a knife. "She is mine!" Millions of views. Thousands of comments every minute. "Who is she?" Cross finally fell for someone? The way he looked at her. Clara stared at the screen in disbelief. There were already blurry screenshots zoomed in on her face, articles calling her the mystery brunette, and wild theories claiming she was secretly engaged to one of the richest men in New York. "Oh no," she whispered under her breath. Her mother walked slowly into the kitchen wearing slippers and an oversized sweater. "What happened?" Clara turned the screen around. Her mother adjusted her glasses, watched the clip once, then looked up carefully. "That man looked very serious when he said that." Clara nearly choked on her coffee. "Mom." But even as she denied it, she could still remember Damien's expression. He had not sounded drunk or playful. If anything, he had sounded irritated that another man even noticed her. The thought made her heart beat faster in a way she absolutely did not appreciate. Meanwhile, Across Manhattan, Cross Meridian headquarters was already in full crisis mode. The executive conference room overlooked Fifth Avenue, but nobody cared about the view. Screens across the walls displayed headlines and social media trends climbing by the second. Damien sat at the head of the table while his public relations director paced nervously beside the monitors. "This is becoming bigger than the product launch," she said. "Female engagement with the company is up 12% overnight." Damien looked unimpressed. "Congratulations." "Sir, I am serious." She clicked another screen. "People are obsessed with the mystery woman. Investors suddenly think you appear more human." Damien leaned back slowly in his chair. "I am not turning some bartender into a publicity campaign. You may not have a choice." The room fell quiet. Damien's legal advisor adjusted his tie carefully before speaking. "Adrian Vale has already started making comments online. If we deny everything now, the media will spin this into another billionaire ego scandal." Damien's eyes darkened slightly at Adrian's name. "What exactly are you suggesting?" The public relations director inhaled carefully. "We confirm that you are seeing her." Silence. One executive nervously cleared his throat. Another avoided eye contact completely. Everyone in New York feared Damien Cross when he went quiet. "Absolutely not," Damien said coldly. "Sir," the advisor continued carefully, "your approval ratings with younger investors are higher this morning than they have been in 3 years." Damien stood slowly from his chair and walked toward the window overlooking Manhattan traffic below. He hated manipulation. He hated fake narratives even more. But what he hated most was the uncomfortable realization that part of him did not entirely dislike the idea of Clara beside him. That was the dangerous part. His assistant stepped forward holding a tablet. "There is one more issue." Damien glanced at him impatiently. "What now?" The assistant swallowed once. "Reporters already found her name." Damien's jaw tightened immediately. "How?" "One of the club employees sold the schedule list." Another silence filled the room. Then Damien asked quietly, "Where does Clara Bennett live?" Nobody answered for a second because suddenly every person in that conference room understood the same thing at once. Damien Cross was no longer protecting a public image. He was protecting her. Clara realized something was wrong the moment she stepped outside her apartment building the next morning. A black SUV sat across the street with tinted windows dark enough to reflect the cloudy New York sky. 2 people holding cameras lingered near the corner coffee cart pretending not to stare at her. The second she appeared on the sidewalk, flashes exploded. "Clara! Over here! Are you dating Damien Cross? How long have you been together?" Her stomach dropped instantly. Clara turned sharply and hurried back toward the building entrance, heart pounding beneath her coat. She hated attention. Hated cameras. Hated feeling exposed. The doorman looked uncomfortable as she rushed past him. "Sorry, Miss Bennett. They have been here since 6 this morning." Clara pressed a hand against her forehead, trying to breathe. This was insane. 24 hours ago she had been an invisible woman carrying cocktail trays. Now strangers were shouting questions about her personal life before breakfast. Her phone suddenly rang in her hand. Unknown number. She almost ignored it before finally answering. "Hello? You should not leave the building alone right now." Clara froze immediately at the deep, calm voice on the other end. Damien Cross. Somehow, hearing him outside that poker room sounded even more dangerous. "Are you serious?" she whispered sharply. "There are reporters outside my apartment because of you." "I know. This is not normal." "No," Damien admitted quietly. "It is not." Clara moved toward the hallway window and carefully peeked outside again. More cameras now. One reporter was literally trying to question her elderly neighbor. "This is ruining my life," she muttered. Silence filled the line for a second before Damien finally said, "I can fix it." Clara laughed once in disbelief. "You caused it. Then let me solve it." Something about his voice irritated her even more because he sounded so calm while her world was collapsing. How exactly do billionaires solve problems like this? She asked bitterly. Lawyers? Payoffs? Contracts? Damien answered. Clara blinked. What? Meet me. No, Clara. The way he said her name made her pulse stumble unexpectedly. Firm. Controlled. Almost careful. I am sending a car. I am not getting into some mysterious billionaire car. You already became the center of a media scandal overnight, Damien replied evenly. At this point, the car is the least dangerous part. 30 minutes later, Clara sat stiffly in the back seat of a black SUV heading toward Midtown Manhattan. Rain streaked across the windows while city traffic crawled below gray skies. She still could not believe she had agreed to this. Mostly because she had not really agreed. Damien's assistant simply arrived downstairs with an umbrella and somehow made refusing feel impossible. Cross Meridian headquarters towered above the avenue like a block of polished black steel. Clara stepped out onto the sidewalk and instantly felt underdressed in her cream sweater and old ankle boots. Men and women in expensive suits moved through the lobby like they belonged to another species entirely. Damien was waiting upstairs in a private office larger than her entire apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Manhattan while soft jazz played quietly somewhere in the background. He stood near the window in a dark navy suit, one hand in his pocket. Calm as always. Untouchable as always. Clara crossed her arms immediately. You owe me an explanation. Damien studied her carefully for a second before speaking. The media cycle will get worse. I figured that out from the photographers outside my building. If we deny everything now, they will follow you harder trying to prove there is a story. Clara stared at him in disbelief. Then tell them the truth. Damien's jaw tightened slightly. The truth is not useful right now. He walked toward the marble desk and slid a thin folder across its surface toward her. Clara looked down slowly. Contractual public relationship agreement. Her eyes widened instantly. You cannot be serious. Damien met her stare directly. 3 months, he said calmly. Pretend to be with me publicly. The scandal stabilizes. The media loses interest. Then we walk away clean. Clara looked back at the contract in stunned silence while somewhere deep inside her chest, a very dangerous feeling began whispering that nothing about Damien Cross was ever going to be simple. Clara stared at the contract for so long the words began to blur together across the expensive paper. 3 months. Public appearances. Confidentiality clauses. Coordinated press interactions. It looked less like a relationship and more like a corporate merger. Slowly, she looked back up at Damien standing across the office. You actually planned this. My legal team planned it, he corrected calmly. That is somehow worse. Damien did not smile. He rarely did. Instead, he walked toward the windows overlooking Manhattan while rain tapped softly against the glass behind him. You need privacy restored. I need the media storm contained. This solves both problems. Clara let out a short, disbelieving laugh. You really think people are going to believe a billionaire suddenly fell for a woman serving drinks at a poker table? Damien glanced back at her. They already do. Unfortunately, he was right. Clara hated that he was right. Her phone had gained 40,000 followers overnight. Random strangers online were analyzing her outfits, her facial expressions, even the way Damien looked at her in the viral clip. It felt invasive and surreal all at once. She crossed her arms tighter. And what exactly happens during these 3 months? Damien moved back toward the desk and opened another folder. Public dinners. 2 charity events. 1 company holiday gala. Occasional staged photographs. Clara blinked. Staged photographs? Welcome to Manhattan. She shook her head slowly. This is insane. Probably, Damien admitted. But it is temporary. Clara studied him carefully then. The strange thing about Damien Cross was that he never sounded manipulative, even when proposing something completely absurd. His voice stayed low, controlled, almost emotionless. But underneath that calm surface, Clara sensed constant tension, like he was always holding something dangerous in place. And after 3 months? She asked quietly. We separate respectfully. The media moves on. Damien answered it like a business forecast. Simple. Efficient. Clean. Clara looked back down at the contract again, but her attention caught on a smaller line near the bottom of the page. Wardrobe consultation provided by Cross Meridian Public Relations Team. Absolutely not, she said immediately. Damien looked genuinely confused for the first time all day. What? Nobody is dressing me. It is standard for public appearances. I am not turning into some billionaire Barbie doll for your investors. To Clara's surprise, something almost amused flickered briefly across Damien's face. Tiny. Gone in seconds. Fine, he said calmly. Keep your own clothes. You are impossible. I have been told that before. Silence settled between them for a moment, while distant thunder rolled somewhere outside the building. Clara hated how intimidating he was. Worse, she hated how strangely safe she felt in this office despite everything. Damien suddenly reached for another document. There are boundaries. Clara narrowed her eyes suspiciously. Boundaries. No personal questions from the media. No overnight appearances together unless necessary for events. No discussing family matters publicly. Clara frowned slightly. Why does that sound like you already have experience doing this? Damien's expression cooled instantly. I do not. Something about the sharpness in his voice warned her not to push further. Instead, she flipped another page and nearly laughed again. Wait. There is literally a section about hand placement. Damien looked almost irritated now. Photographers analyze body language. You cannot be serious. Crossed arms suggest distance. Hand placement at the lower back implies intimacy. Clara stared at him in disbelief for 2 full seconds before laughing despite herself. A real laugh this time. Soft. Uncontrolled. Damien went very still. Like he had not expected that sound. Clara covered her mouth quickly. Sorry. This is just completely ridiculous. But Damien was still watching her now with an expression she could not read. Not cold exactly. Not businesslike anymore either. Just focused. Intensely focused. The room suddenly felt smaller than before. Clara looked away first. If I agree to this, she said carefully, there are my rules too. Damien straightened slightly. Go ahead. No controlling my life outside the cameras. No treating me like an employee. And if your rival makes another comment about me like that again. Her voice hardened slightly. You handle it without acting like you own me. For the first time since she entered the office, Damien looked caught off guard. Only for a second. Then his jaw tightened subtly as if the reminder bothered him more than it should have. Understood, he said quietly. But neither of them missed the strange tension hanging in the air after that. Because the most dangerous part was no longer the fake relationship. It was the growing feeling that Damien Cross had already stopped pretending. 3 days later, Clara stood in front of a wall of cameras pretending her life had not completely spiraled out of control. Flashbulbs exploded across the entrance of the Riverside Children's Foundation Gala while reporters shouted questions from behind security ropes. Manhattan glittered around the waterfront venue, every window reflecting gold against the East River. Clara smoothed her black dress nervously for what felt like the 100th time. She still could not believe she had signed Damien's ridiculous contract. Worse, she still could not believe she had agreed to stand beside him tonight willingly. Relax, Damien murmured beside her as their car stopped near the entrance. Clara looked over sharply. Easy for you to say. You were born in this world. Damien adjusted the cuff of his dark suit calmly. No one relaxes at these events. Some people just hide it better. Before Clara could answer, a staff member opened the car door and a wave of camera flashes immediately hit them. Damien stepped out first. Tall. Composed. Untouchable. Then he turned back toward her and offered his hand naturally, like they had done this 1,000 times before. Clara hesitated only half a second before placing her hand in his. Warm fingers closed gently around hers. Instantly, reporters exploded with excitement. Damien! Clara! Look over here. How did you two meet? Are wedding bells coming soon? Clara nearly stumbled hearing that one. Damien's hand shifted lightly against her lower back, guiding her through the chaos exactly the way the contract described. But somehow the gesture no longer felt rehearsed. It felt protective. Inside the gala, crystal chandeliers glowed above enormous floral displays while waiters carried silver trays between New York's elite. Clara tried not to look overwhelmed, but she could feel eyes following her everywhere. Billionaires. Politicians. Famous actors. Women in gowns worth more than her yearly rent. She leaned slightly closer to Damien. I feel like everyone here knows I do not belong. To her surprise, Damien looked down at her almost immediately. That is because you are the only honest person in the room. Clara blinked softly at him. Before she could respond, another voice interrupted. Well, if it is not Manhattan's favorite mystery couple. Adrian Vale approached with that same smooth, dangerous smile Clara already disliked. His tuxedo looked flawless. So did his confidence. Clara, Adrian said warmly, taking her hand before she could react. You clean up beautifully. Damien's posture shifted instantly beside her. Subtle. But colder somehow. Adrian smirked slightly as if noticing it too. Tell me, he continued casually, does Cross actually smile around you yet? Or are you still negotiating that in quarterly installments? Clara almost laughed despite herself. Damien, however, looked entirely unimpressed. Do not you have another interview to sabotage somewhere? Adrian chuckled softly. Relax. I am only curious. His gaze returned toward Clara again a second too long. Though honestly, I still think she is wasted standing beside someone this emotionally unavailable. Silence stretched between the two men. Clara could practically feel the tension building under Damien's calm expression. Then Damien did something unexpected. He reached toward Clara without even looking away from Adrian and gently adjusted a loose strand of hair near her shoulder. The gesture was small, careful, intimate enough to make Clara's breath catch unexpectedly. Funny, Damien said quietly. She seems perfectly happy where she is. Adrian's smile faded just slightly. Clara looked up at Damien in surprise because that did not sound like part of the contract anymore. It sounded personal. Very personal. Adrian eventually raised both hands with mock surrender before walking away into the crowd. The second he disappeared, Clara exhaled slowly. You two hate each other. Damien took a sip of champagne calmly. That implies mutual passion. Clara rolled her eyes softly, but then her attention drifted toward a massive illuminated donor wall across the ballroom. Hundreds of names covered the display beside photos of children's hospitals and research centers. One section stood larger than all the others. Cross Foundation Pediatric Wing. Clara turned toward Damien slowly. You never mentioned this foundation belonged to you. Damien's expression changed immediately. Not colder. Quieter. I do not usually discuss it publicly. Clara studied the photographs more carefully, then noticed one picture framed separately near the corner. A young girl with dark hair smiling brightly beside a teenage version of Damien. Something inside his face shifted the moment he noticed where she was looking. Pain. Real pain. Who is she? Clara asked gently. Damien stared at the photo for a long moment before answering softly. My sister. And suddenly, for the first time since meeting Damien Cross, Clara realized the coldest man in Manhattan might also be the loneliest. The drive back from the gala felt quieter than any moment Clara had shared with Damien so far. Rain slid down the windows of the black SUV, while Manhattan lights blurred across the glass like fading stars. Usually Damien spent car rides answering emails or taking calls from executives across 3 different time zones. Tonight he did neither. He sat beside her in silence, one hand resting loosely against his knee, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the city outside. Clara kept thinking about the photograph near the donor wall. The little girl smiling beside him. The softness in his expression when he said the words, "My sister." She had never seen that version of Damien before. "You do not have to talk about it," Clara said gently after several quiet minutes. Damien glanced toward her briefly. "Most people in my world avoid uncomfortable conversations. Maybe that is why most people in your world look miserable." To Clara's surprise, the corner of his mouth almost moved again. Not quite a smile, but close enough to warm something unexpectedly deep inside her chest. The car finally stopped outside her apartment building in Queens. Normally Damien's drivers dropped her off and left immediately to avoid attention. Tonight, however, Damien stepped out beside her beneath the glow of the streetlights. Cold wind rushed through the nearly empty street while distant sirens echoed somewhere downtown. Clara pulled her coat tighter. "You really do not need to walk me upstairs," she said. "I know." But he followed her anyway. The tiny apartment suddenly felt impossibly small once Damien entered it. Expensive suit. 6'2" billionaire. Marble cold composure. None of it belonged beside flickering kitchen lights and second-hand furniture. Clara suddenly felt embarrassed by everything around her. The peeling paint. The cramped hallway. The stack of overdue bills she forgot to hide near the sink. Damien noticed them instantly but said nothing. Her mother appeared from the living room wearing reading glasses and immediately froze seeing Damien standing in the doorway. "Oh," she said softly. "You are the serious-looking one from television." Clara covered her face in horror. "Mom!" But to Clara's complete shock, Damien extended his hand politely. "Damien Cross, ma'am." Her mother shook his hand carefully, studying him with the same quiet intelligence Clara carried in her own eyes. "You care about my daughter," she said simply. Damien looked caught off guard for perhaps the first time in his entire adult life. "Mom," Clara whispered again, mortified now. But her mother ignored her completely. "Men who do not care never look that tense standing beside a woman." Clara nearly choked. Damien actually looked away for a second. It was such a human reaction that Clara forgot to breathe for a moment. A few minutes later her mother disappeared back toward her room, leaving Clara and Damien alone in the kitchen. Silence settled softly between them while rain tapped against the windows. Clara leaned against the counter carefully. "You do not have to keep pretending when nobody is watching." Damien loosened his tie slightly, exhaustion finally showing through the perfect billionaire mask. "That is the problem." Clara frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" Damien looked at her then. Really looked at her. Like he was trying to understand something dangerous unfolding inside himself. "I do not know where the pretending stopped." The air between them shifted instantly. Clara's pulse stumbled hard against her ribs. Damien stepped closer slowly, close enough now that she could catch the faint scent of cedar and rain on his coat. Every instinct told her to step back. She did not. "Damien," she whispered carefully. But before another word could form, his phone suddenly rang sharply through the apartment. The moment shattered instantly. Damien closed his eyes briefly, frustrated by the interruption, before answering. "What?" Clara watched his expression darken almost immediately. "When?" he asked coldly. Silence. Then his jaw tightened hard. "Send me everything." He hung up slowly. "What happened?" Clara asked. Damien looked at her with an expression she had never seen before. Anger mixed with something dangerously protective. "Adrian leaked the relationship contract to the press." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. And for the first time since this fake relationship began, she realized their biggest problem was no longer pretending to be together. It was what would happen when the entire world discovered the truth. By morning, the scandal had detonated across every major news network in America. Clara stood frozen inside her apartment kitchen while television anchors dissected her personal life like entertainment. Split screens flashed across the broadcast. Damien arriving at galas beside her. Their staged photographs. Then leaked pages from the relationship contract spinning slowly across giant screens behind smiling reporters. Was America's favorite billionaire romance completely fake? Did Damien Cross manipulate the public for corporate gain? Who is Clara Bennett really? Clara grabbed the remote and shut the television off hard enough to make the screen flicker black. Silence crashed through the apartment instantly. Her chest burned with humiliation, anger, shame. The worst part was not the headlines. It was realizing that somewhere beneath all the fake dates and staged appearances, she had started believing some of it was real. Her phone buzzed again across the counter. Damien. She stared at his name for several seconds before rejecting the call. Immediately another call came through. Then another. Finally a text appeared. Please let me explain. Clara laughed bitterly under her breath. Explain what exactly? That she had become a carefully managed public relations strategy for one of the richest men in New York? Outside her apartment building, reporters already crowded the sidewalk again. Camera flashes reflected through the windows like lightning. Her mother walked quietly into the kitchen, concern written across her tired face. Sweetheart. Clara shook her head immediately, fighting the sting behind her eyes. I was stupid. No. Her mother stepped closer gently. You were hopeful. There is a difference. Across Manhattan, Damien Cross was losing control of his empire for the first time in years. The Cross Meridian boardroom had turned openly hostile. Executives argued across the massive table while financial analysts projected falling stock numbers across giant screens. You lied to investors, one board member snapped. This relationship was fabricated for public image manipulation. The contract was never intended to become public, Damien answered coldly. Adrian Vale sat near the far end of the room looking entirely too relaxed. That almost sounds like an admission of guilt, he said smoothly. Damien's eyes locked onto him instantly. Dangerous. Controlled. Adrian only smiled wider. You know, Adrian continued casually, the public would probably forgive you if the girl looked happier. Damien stood slowly from his chair. Silence swallowed the entire room. Everyone suddenly looked nervous. Careful, Damien said quietly. Adrian leaned back smugly. Or what? Damien stared at him for one long second before speaking again. You mistake restraint for weakness. Even Adrian's smile faded slightly after that. Before the confrontation could escalate further, Damien's assistant rushed into the room holding a tablet. Sir, he said carefully, the shareholders' meeting starts in 10 minutes. Damien closed his eyes briefly. The timing could not have been worse. Hundreds of investors. National media coverage. Live financial broadcast. And now an empire hanging by a thread because of one leaked contract and one woman he could not stop thinking about. Minutes later, Damien stepped onto the massive stage inside Cross Meridian's annual shareholder conference. Camera flashes exploded instantly. Reporters shouted questions before he even reached the podium. Behind him, giant screens displayed the company logo towering above the packed auditorium. Damien adjusted the microphone calmly while the noise slowly settled. Then a reporter shouted from the crowd. Was Clara Bennett ever anything more than a paid actress? The question hit harder than it should have. Damien felt something sharp twist in his chest immediately because the terrifying part was simple now. He no longer knew the answer himself. Another reporter stood quickly. Did you ever actually care about her? Silence spread across the auditorium. Damien looked out across hundreds of waiting faces. Investors. Cameras. Rivals. An entire empire expecting the cold, calculated billionaire they trusted. Instead, all he could picture was Clara laughing in his office. Clara standing beside him beneath chandelier lights. Clara looking hurt after discovering the contract. Somewhere along the way, the lines had disappeared. The pretending had disappeared. Damien finally looked directly toward the cameras broadcasting live across the country. No, he said quietly. The room instantly erupted with whispers. Damien loosened his tie slowly, exhaustion and honesty finally breaking through the billionaire mask. I did not lose control because of a contract. His voice deepened slightly. Real now. Vulnerable in a way nobody had ever heard before. I lost control the moment I called her mine. The entire auditorium went completely silent. The silence after Damien's confession lasted less than 3 seconds before the entire auditorium exploded into chaos. Reporters jumped to their feet shouting questions while camera flashes lit the massive conference hall like lightning strikes. Investors stared at each other in disbelief. Somewhere near the back of the room, Adrian Vale looked furious for the first time in weeks. But Damien barely noticed any of it anymore. His pulse hammered hard against his ribs while one thought repeated through his mind over and over. Clara. Before another reporter could speak, Damien stepped away from the podium entirely. Sir? His assistant called in shock from backstage. Damien loosened the microphone from his jacket and dropped it onto the conference table without slowing down. Behind him, the cross-meridian board erupted in outrage, but he kept walking straight through the flashing cameras toward the exit. For once in his life, Damien Cross chose something more important than control. 20 minutes later, rain poured across Manhattan in silver sheets while Clara stood alone inside her mother's old art cafe in Queens. The tiny space had been closed for nearly 2 years after medical bills forced them to shut it down, but Clara still came sometimes when life felt too heavy. Dust covered the empty tables while faded paintings leaned quietly against brick walls. Her mother's old piano sat untouched near the window. It was the only place in New York that still felt honest. Clara stood near the counter staring at the television mounted above the cafe shelves. Damien's confession replayed across every news station. I lost control the moment I called her mine. Hearing the words now felt different somehow. Not possessive. Not arrogant. Honest. Painfully honest. A soft knock suddenly echoed through the cafe. Clara turned slowly. Damien stood outside beneath the rain wearing no overcoat, dark hair damp from the storm. No security team. No assistants. No billionaire performance. Just him. For a second neither of them moved. Then Clara quietly unlocked the door. Damien stepped inside while rainwater dripped softly onto the wooden floorboards. The cafe suddenly felt very small around him. Clara crossed her arms carefully. You abandoned a live shareholders meeting. Apparently the board considers that dramatic. Despite herself, Clara almost smiled. Almost. Damien looked around the cafe slowly. This was your mother's place. Clara nodded. Before the medical bills. Damien's eyes settled on the faded paintings covering the walls. It is beautiful. It used to be. Silence drifted softly between them. Then Damien reached into his jacket pocket and placed something gently onto the counter between them. The relationship contract. Torn cleanly in half. Clara stared down at it quietly while Damien's voice lowered. I should have never reduced you to paperwork. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. Damien stepped closer slowly. You were right that night in my office. Clara looked up at him carefully. About what? His jaw shifted slightly like honesty still felt unfamiliar to him. I acted like I owned everything around me. He paused. But you are not something to possess, Clara. Rain tapped softly against the cafe windows while the city outside blurred beneath gray evening light. Damien pulled something else from his pocket then. A small velvet box. Clara's breath caught instantly. Damien, I am not asking because of cameras, he said quietly. And not because of a scandal. He opened the box slowly, revealing a simple elegant ring that somehow felt far more intimate than any extravagant diamond she imagined a billionaire would choose. I am asking because somewhere between fake dinners and staged photographs. His voice softened slightly. You became the first person who ever made me feel like more than a company. Clara felt tears sting her eyes before she could stop them. Damien looked nervous now. Actually nervous. The realization almost broke her heart all by itself. I do not want ownership anymore, he said quietly. I want partnership. For one long second, the entire world seemed to disappear around them. No cameras. No contracts. No billion-dollar empire waiting outside. Just a lonely billionaire and the woman who accidentally taught him how to feel human again. Clara stepped closer slowly until only inches separated them. Then she smiled softly through the tears in her eyes. You know, she whispered gently, for someone so good at business deals, you are surprisingly terrible at pretending. Damien finally laughed quietly for the first time since she met him. Real laughter this time. Warm. Unguarded. And when Clara kissed him beneath the soft glow of the old cafe lights while rain fell across Manhattan outside, Damien Cross realized the most valuable thing he had ever built was not an empire. It was finally finding someone who loved him when there was nothing left to hide.